The morning mist lay thick over the village of Little Darrow, curling through the narrow lanes and clinging to the hedgerows in a way that muffled sound and softened the outlines of the quaint thatched cottages. The clock on St. Edmund's Church struck 8, a deep and resonant chime that seemed to stir the village awake at Honeysuckle Cottage. Miss Jane Marple set down her embroidery, tilting her head slightly as she listened to the distant tolling of the bells. There was something rather peaceful about mornings in Little Darrow, a certain predictability to village life that, in her experience, often concealed unexpected disturbances. She sipped her tea and glanced out the window at the narrow lane beyond, where the postman, Mr. Finch, was making his rounds. His sturdy frame was barely visible in the mist, but Miss Marple could tell by the briskness of his step that he was in one of his chatty moods. Sure enough, as he reached Brambledown House, he paused, leaning over the low stone wall to exchange words with his occupant, Colonel Geoffrey Fanshawe, the retired army man, dressed in his usual tweed suit, clearly responding with some agitation, his hand waving dismissively. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. Colonel Fanshawe was not a man easily disturbed. She took another sip of her tea. In her experience, these small disruptions, the seemingly trivial flutters in the usual patterns of village life, often signaled the beginnings of something much larger. And as she watched the colonel retreat inside, closing the door rather more forcefully than necessary, Miss Marple had the oddest feeling that something was about to happen in Little Darrow by midday. The fog had lifted, revealing a crisp autumn afternoon. The village, always a place of quiet routine, quays with its usual comings and goings at the Red Hart Inn. The local innkeeper, Mr. Bellamy, polished glasses while exchanging gossip with Mrs. Kirby, the postmistress, near the baker's shop. Young Henry Davies, the vicar's nephew, cycled past with a bundle of books, nearly toppling over when he swerved to avoid Mrs. Webb's excitable terrier. It was a typical day in Little Darren, till it wasn't. The first sign that something was amiss came when a sharp cry rang out near the edge of the village green dot. Mrs. Longworth, a widow of formidable energy and sharper opinions, had been out gathering rose hips for her winter preserves when she stumbled upon a most unsettling sight. At the foot of a gnarled oak tree, lying motionless upon the damp earth, was Colonel Geoffrey Fanshawe. His face was eerily pale. His tweed jacket stained dark with something that should not have been there, and in the eerie silence that followed Mrs. Longworth's scream, the village of Little Darrow realized that murder had arrived at their doorstep by the time Miss Marple arrived, escorted by a rather breathless Dr. Lucas. A small crowd had already gathered at the scene. She moved quietly through the throng, listening to the murmurs of speculation. "Heart attack," muttered Mr. Sims, the grocer. "That's what it'll be." "Nonsense," Mrs. Kirby countered. "Look at the blood. Was it an accident?" whispered young Mary Trent, clutching her mother's hand. Miss Marple did not speak, but she observed. Colonel Fanshawe lay oddly still, his right hand curled slightly, his left resting across his stomach. There was a strange stain on his cuff. Miss Marple noticed quite distinctly the absence of his walking cane, which he never went anywhere without. She tilted her head, looking toward the road. The nearest houses were some distance away, but Brambledown House, the colonel's residence, was visible beyond the hedgerow. Had he been walking home when he was attacked? Or had he come here to meet someone? Her gaze flickered toward the other villagers, their faces filled with horror, curiosity, and something else, something deeper, fear. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her. Yes, she thought. Something dark had stirred beneath the surface of Little Darrow, and she fully intended to find out what. The arrival of Inspector Graves from the county police only deepened the intrigue. A tall man with a practical demeanor immediately set about questioning the assembled villagers. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, stood to the side, listening carefully. Mrs. Longworth repeated her account of the discovery, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and the thrill of being at the center of such an event. "I was only gathering rose hips," she insisted, and there he was, poor man, as still as anything. Inspector Graves jotted down notes. "Tay, and you saw no one else?" Mrs. Longworth hesitated. "Not at the time, no." Miss Marple's gaze flickered. "Not at the time." An interesting choice of words. The grocer, Mr. Sims, chimed in next. "I saw him just this morning. He was talking to the postman. Seemed upset about something." Miss Marple nodded slightly to herself. Yes, she had seen that too. Inspector Graves turned toward Dr. Lucas, who had been crouching beside the body. "Well, Doctor," Dr. Lucas sighed, straightening. "The colonel's been dead for a few hours, at least. A blow to the head, I'd wager, but I'll know more after I examine him properly." Miss Marple, seemingly lost in thought, tilted her head slightly. A blow to the head, not a fall, not a stroke or a heart attack. Murder. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple took a moment to think. Colonel Fanshawe was not a man to be easily waylaid. He had been a military man, sharp and disciplined, which meant that whoever had attacked him had either been unexpected or someone he trusted. And then there was the question of his missing cane. Why had it not been found near his body? Had it been taken? Or had he dropped it somewhere else before he arrived at the village green? Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, there was something unnatural about all of this, and she intended to uncover it. She turned toward Inspector Graves, offering one of her gentlest smiles. "Inspector," she said lightly, "if you have a moment, okay? I believe I may have a little thought or two about all this." Inspector Graves glanced at her, half exasperated, half amused. "Do you, Miss Marple?" She gave a small nod. "Oh yes, Inspector," she murmured. "You see, I do believe that Colonel Fanshawe was meant to die elsewhere." And with that, the real hunt for the murderer began. By the next morning, the news had spread through Little Darrow like wildfire. It began in the Red Hart, where Mr. Bellamy, the innkeeper, counted the discovery of Colonel Fanshawe's body to his early patrons over steaming cups of tea. "Dead. Just like that," he declared, shaking his head. "A man like the colonel, taken in his prime." "His prime," scoffed Mrs. Webb, the butcher's wife. "He was 70 if he was a day." "But still, Hale," insisted Mr. Sims, the grocer, "walked everywhere, still shot pigeons in the fields. He wasn't one to keel over just like that." Mrs. Kirby, the postmistress, leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, it wasn't natural causes, was it?" she whispered. "I heard from Mrs. Longworth Poor. Man had a blow to the head." That revelation sent a ripple of shock through the room. "Who would want to kill Colonel Fanshawe?" Mrs. Webb murmured. "He never harmed a soul." Said Mrs. Kirby. "You never know with men like him. Military-type secrets and such. Maybe someone from his past caught up with him." Mr. Sims snorted. "Or someone closer to home. I saw him having words with the postman yesterday. He wasn't happy, I can tell you that. Mr. Finch." Mrs. Webb's eyes widened. "Why, he's hardly the murdering kind." "Who knows?" muttered Mr. Sims. "You'd be surprised what a man will do if pushed." While the village busied itself with theories, Miss Marple remained, as ever, quietly observant. She was at Mrs. Longworth's tea shop, seated near the window with her knitting, while the shopkeeper bustled about serving customers. A low hum of gossip filled the space. "It's an outrage," Mrs. Longworth huffed, refilling a teapot. "A man murdered in our very village. It simply isn't done." "Have they arrested anyone?" asked Miss Peters, the schoolteacher, lowering her voice. Mrs. Longworth shook her head. "Inspector Graves was asking questions all yesterday, but no one's been taken in yet." Miss Marple, watching the exchange with polite interest, let out a thoughtful under her breath. She had known Colonel Fanshawe well enough, a straightforward man, perhaps a little gruff, but not the type to have sinister secrets buried in his past. And yet, she kept returning to that missing walking cane, and to the way he had spoken so sharply to Mr. Finch, the postman, just hours before his death. By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Inspector Graves, who was conducting interviews at the Red Hart Inn. The inspector was a solid, no-nonsense man, his mustache neatly trimmed, his jacket worn but well pressed. He was seated at the bar, his notebook open, while Mr. Finch, the postman, stood before him, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Now, Mr. Finch," Graves said, his tone firm. "Several villagers saw you speaking with Colonel Fanshawe yesterday morning. What was that about?" Mr. Finch shifted, clearing his throat. "It was nothing at all, really." Inspector Graves raised an eyebrow. "Then why did Colonel Fanshawe appear upset?" Mr. Finch licked his lips nervously. It was about a letter. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her tea, stilled her knitting ever so slightly. Inspector Graves leaned in. What letter?" Mr. Finch hesitated. It was a letter addressed to him, but it was odd. Odd in what way? The postman swallowed. It had no sender's name. "It's just for Colonel Geoffrey Fanshurgent, and when I gave it to him, he turned pale as anything." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes slightly. A mysterious letter, arriving just before the Colonel's murder. How very interesting, that Inspector Graves jotted something in his notebook. "And where is this letter now?" Mr. Finch wrung his hands. "I don't know. He took it with him when he left." "And what time was this?" "A little before 8 o'clock, Mr. Finch replied. I remember, because I was running late on my rounds." Inspector Graves tapped his pen against the page. "And that was the last time you saw him?" "Yes, sir." The inspector closed his notebook. "All right, Mr. Finch. That will be all for now." Mr. Finch nodded quickly and left, looking relieved but unsettled. Miss Marple finally spoke. "It does seem rather curious, doesn't it, Inspector?" Graves turned to her, looking both amused and wary. "What does, Miss Marple?" She smiled pleasantly. "Why, that a man like Colonel Fanshawe, rather unflappable sort of gentleman, should look so pale over a simple letter. It makes one wonder what it contained." Inspector Graves gave a small chuckle. "Indeed, but without the letter, we have no way of knowing." Miss Marple nodded agreeably, though her eyes remained sharp. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector. I suspect the contents of that letter may reveal themselves soon enough." Graves gave her a long look. "And what makes you think that?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. "Because if there's one thing I've learned in life, Inspector, it's that secrets have a way of making themselves known." That afternoon, as Miss Marple walked through the village green, she allowed her mind to settle on two very peculiar details about the letter. The Colonel had received it just before his murder, and it had clearly shaken him, and his missing walking cane. She frowned. Why had it not been found near his body? If he'd have been attacked while walking, surely it would have been there. But it wasn't, which meant only one thing. The Colonel had not been killed where he was found. Someone had moved his body. A thought fluttered at the edges of her mind. Something small but significant. Something she had noticed but not yet fully understood. And then, as she passed Brambledown House, her gaze fell upon something in the hedgerow nearby. Something long, dark, and partially hidden beneath the leaves. Miss Marple paused, her breath catching. Stepping forward, she reached down and gently pulled it from the undergrowth. It was a walking cane, Colonel Fanshawe's walking cane. And suddenly, Miss Marple knew the Colonel had been attacked somewhere else entirely, which meant that someone in Little Darrow had gone through a great deal of trouble to conceal the truth, and the real mystery was why. Miss Marple stood by the hedgerow, turning the walking cane over in her hands. The wood was smooth and well worn, its handle crafted from polished silver. It was undoubtedly Colonel Fanshaw's, a piece as familiar to the village as the colonel himself, yet here it lay, half buried in the undergrowth. Far from where his body had been found, Miss Marple's lips pursed. This one small detail had been troubling her ever since they had discovered the colonel's murder. And now, with the cane in her hands, she was more certain than ever Colonel Fanshawe had not died where his body had been found. Someone had moved him, carefully staging the scene, ensuring that his body was discovered in a public place rather than where the crime had actually occurred. But why? And, perhaps more importantly, who? Miss Marple slipped the cane under her arm and turned toward Brambledown House. The colonel's residence loomed in the near distance, its stone walls half obscured by the curling ivy that had grown thick around the windows. It was an old house, well kept, but lonely. Just like its owner. Miss Marple thought for a moment, then nodded to herself. Yes, that was where she must go next. If the colonel had not been killed at the village green, then the most logical place to look for answers was his own home. Inspector Graves was already at Brambledown House, standing in the colonel's study and flipping through a stack of neatly ordered documents. A faint scowl lingered on his face as he turned the pages. Miss Marple arrived just in time to hear him sigh heavily. Nothing out of the ordinary, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Household accounts, correspondence, some military papers. All very dull, really. Miss Marple smiled kindly as she stepped forward. Dull things, Inspector, are often the most illuminating. Only one knows how to look at them properly. Graves turned, eyebrows raised. Ah, Miss Marple, you do have a habit of appearing at interesting moments. She chuckled. Okay, not a habit, Inspector. Just good timing. Graves gestured toward the desk, where several letters and documents were spread out. See for yourself. Nothing seems remotely suspicious. Miss Marple stepped closer, letting her keen eyes drift over the papers, neatly stacked bills. A letter from an old military acquaintance. A few personal notes, and then something small, tucked at the very corner of the desk. A scrap of paper, torn from something larger. Miss Marple gently lifted it, tilting it toward the light. It was part of a letter, but only a single line remained. You do not comply, there will be consequences. A chill passed over her. Inspector, she murmured, holding up the paper. I rather think this is important. Graves leaned forward, frowning. A threat? Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, but a rather interesting one. You see, it does not say what must be complied with. It suggests the colonel was being, shall we say, coerced. Graves let out a low whistle. That does change things. Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. Yes, this was what she had been looking for. A hidden clue, one that suggested Colonel Fanshawe was in trouble before his murder, and she had a growing suspicion that this unfinished letter, Spran, and the mysterious one delivered by Mr. Finch were very much connected. While Inspector Graves continued to sort through the papers, Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak with Mrs. Dobson, the colonel's housekeeper, a plump woman in her 50s. Mrs. Dobson had worked for Colonel Fanshawe for many years, running his household with quiet efficiency. But today, her face was drawn, her hands twisting together as she spoke. It's a wicked thing, she murmured, shaking her head. To think someone did that to the colonel. It makes my blood run cold. It does. Miss Marple offered a gentle nod. You knew him well, didn't you? Mrs. Dobson sniffed, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. As well as anyone could, I suppose. He was a private man, kept to himself, mostly. Miss Marple hesitated, then asked, did he have any visitors recently? Mrs. Dobson frowned. Well, there was a gentleman last week. Came in the evening, late. The colonel wasn't expecting him, and I remember him being quite upset afterward. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did you happen to hear their conversation? Mrs. Dobson hesitated. Not much. It's just a few words, as I passed by the door. The visitor said something about owing a debt and that it was time to pay. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Did you see the visitor?" Mrs. Dobson shook her head. "Only a little. Tall fellow, dark coat. But I did notice something." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "He had a scar on his hand, right across his knuckles. I remember, because he tapped them against the colonel's desk while he was talking." Miss Marple's mind word. A man with a scarred hand. A demand for payment. And now, a death. Oh yes, there was far more to this murder than met the eye. Returning to the study, Miss Marple found Inspector Graves rubbing his chin, deep in thought. "Well," he said, looking at her, "it seems our colonel was being blackmailed." Miss Marple nodded. "I rather think so. And from what Mrs. Dobson has told me, I believe the blackmailer may have visited him just days before his murder." Graves straightened sharply. "Who?" Miss Marple smiled lightly. "A tall man with a scar across his knuckles." Graves let out a low curse. "That certainly gives us something to look for." Miss Marple folded her hands, gazing toward the window where the autumn wind stirred the leaves outside. "Yes, Inspector," she murmured. "It does indeed." But in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning, and before long, another secret would come to light. The morning air in Little Darrow was sharp with the promise of rain, but Miss Marple barely noticed as she made her way through the village. The walking cane, now safely tucked away in her basket, was more than just an object. It was evidence. And evidence, as she well knew, had a way of leading one to the truth. She had barely stepped onto the main street when Reverend Leonard Pritchard called out to her from the church gate. He was a mild-mannered, bookish man, but today he seemed uncharacteristically troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple. Terrible, terrible business about the colonel," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "A wicked thing to have happened in our village." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so, Reverend. Though I understand you spoke with Colonel Fanshawe not long before his passing." The Reverend hesitated before answering. "Yes, he came to me last week. He seemed uneasy. He spoke about a past mistake, one that had come back to haunt him." Miss Marple's knitting bag tightened slightly in her grasp. "Did he say what sort of mistake?" "No, only that it involved a promise made long ago. He was looking for guidance, wondering if redemption was always possible." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter that had so disturbed the colonel. The mysterious visitor with the scarred hand, and now the suggestion of an old promise. It was all beginning to connect. She thanked the Reverend and continued on her way. There was someone else in the village who needed speaking to. She rather thought she would get some answers now. The Red Hart Inn was unusually quiet that morning, save for Mr. Bellamy, the innkeeper, who was busy arranging bottles behind the bar. His heavy-set frame blocked most of the light from the window, but when he turned and saw Miss Marple, he gave her his usual polite, slightly wary smile. Double quotes. "Ah, Miss Marple, come for morning tea." She smiled in return. "Oh no, dear. I've come for something quite different." Bellamy wiped his hands on a cloth. "And what might that be?" "The truth, Mr. Bellamy." He stiffened ever so slightly, the only sign that her words had struck home. "I know you visited Colonel Fanshawe shortly before his death." She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Dobson saw you." Bellamy exhaled sharply. "And what of it?" "I was paying my respects." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I think you were doing something quite different." Bellamy's jaw tightened. "You're making a lot of accusations, Miss Marple." She smiled. "Oh, not at all. I simply have an understanding of human nature. The colonel was in trouble, wasn't he? And you were a part of it." Bellamy slammed a hand down on the counter, his composure finally slipping. "Damn it, woman. You don't know what you're talking about." The entire inn fell silent. A slow, uneasy hush spread through the few patrons sitting at their tables. Miss Marple remained unfazed, her eyes fixed steadily on him. "Oh, but I do," she said softly. The colonel was being pressured over something from his past. Something he owed, something that had finally caught up with him. Bellamy let out a bitter laugh. "And you think I had something to do with it? I think you know more than you've said," she replied. "And I think it's time you stopped pretending. Otherwise—" There was a long, tense pause. Then Bellamy exhaled heavily and leaned against the bar. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, tired. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple." She inclined her head. "I rather thought not." Bellamy rubbed a hand over his face. "But he was in trouble. That much is true. And I did go to see him that night." Miss Marple waited patiently. Bellamy sighed. "The colonel and I, we served together, long time ago, back in India." He looked at her. "Did you know that?" Miss Marple nodded slightly. My suspicions." He exhaled. "Well, we weren't just stationed together. We were part of something that went bad." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing him to continue. "There was a man," Bellamy went on, "an officer. He was accused of something stealing from the regiment. There was no proof, but, well, back then, proof didn't matter much. A key was thrown out, disgraced." Bellamy's voice grew quieter. "The colonel and I, we let it happen. We knew he hadn't done it, but we said nothing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And now, after all these years, someone was holding him accountable." Bellamy's hands clenched. "The man's son came looking for him, found out the truth. He wanted justice or repayment." Miss Marple's mind immediately flashed to the scarred man Mrs. Dobson had seen. "The son," she said softly. "A tall man with a scar on his hand." Bellamy looked at her in surprise. "That's him. God, did you?" "Oh, it hardly matters," Miss Marple murmured. "What matters is what happened next." Bellamy ran a hand over his face. "No, I warned the colonel, told him to do something before it got out of hand. He said he'd handle it." His expression darkened. "Next thing I know, he's dead." Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. The son of a wrongfully accused man, a demand for justice, a long-buried lie finally surfacing, and now a murder. She gave Bellamy a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. You've been very helpful." Bellamy scoffed. "If you say so." Miss Marple turned, making her way toward the door. As she stepped outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the autumn leaves along the street. She knew now what had. It happened. She only had to prove it, and she suspected that someone in Little Darrow was about to make a very foolish mistake. The sky had darkened over Little Darrow, the crisp autumn air thick with tension as Miss Marple walked purposefully back toward Honeysuckle Cottage. She had learned a great deal that morning, perhaps too much, and she could feel the weight of it pressing upon her. Colonel Fanshaw's past had finally caught up with him, in the form of a man seeking justice for his father. But there was one question that still gnawed at her. Had that man, the son of the disgraced officer, actually murdered the colonel? Or was there another hand in all of this? Miss Marple's instincts told her that something was amiss, and as she turned the corner near the village green, her suspicions were suddenly confirmed. The moment Miss Marple reached her garden gate, she knew something was wrong. The air felt different, charged with an unusual stillness. Her front door, which she had locked securely before leaving, was now slightly ajar. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The sitting room was just as she had left it, teacup still on the table, knitting basket by her chair. But the study door, which she had closed that morning, was now slightly open, revealing the faintest flicker of movement inside. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, but her expression remained calm. She took another step forward, and then the floorboard creaked. The figure inside the study froze, then turned sharply toward her. Miss Marple found herself staring into the eyes of a stranger, a tall man, dressed in a dark overcoat, with sharp features and an undeniable air of tension about him, and across the knuckles of his right hand, jagged scarred. Miss Marple's voice was steady. "I take it you are the man who came to see Colonel Fanshawe before he died." The man exhaled sharply, his gaze flickering toward the door as if considering escape. "I," he began, then stopped himself. He shook his head. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "No," she said quietly. "I rather think you didn't." The stranger looked at her warily, as though trying to determine whether or not she was a threat. Miss Marple, for her part, simply folded her hands and gestured toward the hearthside chair. "Please, do sit," she said pleasantly. "Great. Many people make the mistake of underestimating me, but I assure you, if you had meant me harm, you would have already acted. And if you are not here to harm me, then there is no reason for you to remain standing so uncomfortably." The man hesitated, but then, as if realizing the futility of flight, he sighed and sat down. "I suppose," he muttered, "you already know why I came to Little Darrow." Miss Marple sat across from him, tilting her head ever so slightly. "I have my suspicions, but I do so dislike making assumptions." The man let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You're different from the others in this village." Miss Marple smiled. "Not so different, I think. I simply listen more than most." There was a long pause before the man finally spoke. "My name is Samuel Redfern," he admitted. "And yes, I came here because of Colonel Fanshawe." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair. "Because of what happened to your father?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Yes, my father was Major Redfern, and he was an honorable man. But they ruined him." His jaw tightened. "Fanshawe and his lot accused him of theft, destroyed his reputation, cast him out of the regiment. He spent the rest of his life drinking himself into oblivion, while he exhaled sharply. "They went on as if nothing had happened." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "And so you sought him out?" Samuel's eyes were hard. "I wanted him to admit what he did." Miss Marple nodded. "And did he?" Samuel hesitated. "No." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Miss Marple could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "He denied everything," Samuel continued. "Even when I showed him the proof." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Proof?" Samuel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a faded, yellowed piece of paper. "It took me years to track it down," he said. "But this was my father's journal." Miss Marple took the paper carefully, unfolding it with delicate hands. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in an unsteady but unmistakable hand, was a single name: Jeffrey Fanshawe. Miss Marple exhaled softly. There it was. The colonel had been named, implicated in a cover-up that had destroyed a man's life. She looked up at Samuel. "And after you showed him this?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "He told me to leave. Said it was ancient history, that I should stop digging up the past." His fists tightened. "But he was afraid. I could see it in his face." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I imagine he was, because that journal, that single piece of paper, was motive enough for murder." Miss Marple took a deep breath. "You confronted him that evening. What time did you leave?" Samuel frowned. "It must have been round 8:30. He was still alive when I left." Miss Marple gave a small nod. That meant the colonel had been killed sometime after that. Samuel hesitated. "You believe me, don't you?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Yes, I do," she said. "But I rather think someone else does not." Samuel's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple stood, smoothing the folds of her skirt. I mean, she says, gently, that someone in Little Darrow is trying very hard to make it seem as though you are the murderer. Samuel's eyes widened. Miss Marple gave him an understanding nod. Come, Mr. Redfern, she said lightly. I rather think we must pay a visit to Inspector Graves. And with that, Miss Marple led Samuel Redfern out into the village once more, knowing that the real killer was still out there watching. And soon, very soon, they would make a mistake. The narrow streets of Little Darrow were unusually quiet as Miss Marple and Samuel Redfern made their way toward the police station, their steps echoing against the cobbled pavement. The sun had dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows over the village, and the crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from the evening chill. Someone wanted to frame Mr. Redfern for the Colonel's murder. It was a simple truth, but one that carried dangerous implications, because if someone had gone to such trouble to set him up, it meant one thing: the real killer was growing desperate, and desperate people, especially murderers, tended to make mistakes. As they turned the final corner toward the police station, Miss Marple suddenly stopped short. A figure was waiting for them in the shadows, leaning against the low stone wall near the station entrance. Inspector Graves. His sharp eyes flickered towards Samuel Redfern, then back to Miss Marple. I'd hoped you'd come to me sooner, Miss Marple, he said, his voice even. You've been stirring the waters quite a bit, haven't you? Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh, Inspector, I do think the waters were already quite stirred before I arrived. Graves exhaled, glancing at Samuel. You should know, Mr. Redfern, that you've become quite the topic of interest. Samuel tensed. What does that mean? Graves gave him a measured look. It means that someone, an anonymous source, has made a formal statement against you. Miss Marple's fingers curled slightly around the handle of her knitting bag. She had expected this, but even so, it was troubling. May we hear the nature of the statement, Inspector? She asked. Graves studied her for a moment before nodding. A villager claims to have seen you, Mr. Redfern, lurking near the green on the night of the murder, near where the Colonel's body was found. Samuel's face darkened. A lie? Graves shrugged slightly. Perhaps. But an accusation like that, coupled with your confrontation with Fanshawe, it doesn't paint you in a particularly innocent light. Miss Marple sighed softly. And may I ask who made this statement? Graves smirked. Now, Miss Marple. You know I can't say. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Though, I do understand, Inspector. But, I dare say, I already know. Answer. Graves frowned. You do? Miss Marple's smile did not waver. Oh, yes. I rather think the person who accused Mr. Redfern is the same person who moved Colonel Fanshaw's body after his murder. Graves's entire posture shifted. At that, moved. Samuel looked at her, confused. You mean he wasn't killed where they found him? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Precisely, and I do believe I can prove it. Minutes later, Miss Marple, Samuel, and Inspector Graves stood on the village green, the very spot where Colonel Fanshaw's body had been found. The night was still, and the lantern light flickered across the damp grass, illuminating the exact spot where the murder had been staged. Miss Marple took a slow step forward, Carrie scanning the ground. Tell me, Inspector, she said lightly, when you found the Colonel's body, did you happen to notice anything unusual? Graves folded his arms. I see a lot of things, Miss Marple. You'll have to be more specific. Miss Marple smiled. Well, for instance, where was the blood? Graves frowned. What? Okay. She turned to face him, her eyes sharp. A man struck fatally in the head would have bled, and yet, when the body was found, there was very little blood at the scene. Graves opened his mouth, then closed it again. His brow furrowed deeply. Miss Marple nodded knowingly. That's because the colonel wasn't killed here. He was killed elsewhere, then moved. And the person who moved him would have been very eager to ensure that attention remained here, rather than at the actual crime scene. Samuel's jaw clenched. And the easiest way to do that, he murmured, realization dawning, was to frame someone else. Graves exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn it, Miss Marple's voice was soft but certain. Now, Inspector, I think we must ask who would have access to the colonel's house that evening. Graves stiffened. Then, slowly, his eyes widened. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Yes, she murmured. I do believe we must pay Mrs. Dobson another visit. By the time they reached Brambledown House, a cold wind had begun whispering through the trees, rattling the windows of the old house. The door was slightly ajar. Inspector Graves's hand immediately went to his revolver. Stay behind me. But Miss Marple did not listen. She stepped forward just as the door creaked open, and there, standing in the dim hallway, was Mrs. Dobson. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling. Inspector, she breathed. I was going to come too. Her voice broke. I can't keep lying anymore. Graves strode forward. Lying about what? Tears welled in the woman's eyes. It was me. I moved him. I had to. Miss Marple watched carefully, saying nothing. Mrs. Dobson gripped the doorframe, her voice thick with emotion. I found him in the house, dead. He was already gone. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. She shuddered, so I dragged him to the green. I thought if they found him there, it would look like a robbery or an accident. Samuel took a slow step forward. If you didn't kill him. Mrs. Dobson shook her head violently. No, I swear it. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Then who did? Mrs. Dobson's face crumbled, her entire body racked with sobs. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Dobson, dear, she murmured, you must tell us the truth, because the person who killed the colonel is still out there, and they have been very careful about covering their tracks. Okay. Mrs. Dobson looked up at her, eyes full of fear and hesitation, and then a sound from behind them, a footstep on the stairs. Miss Marple went very still. She turned just as a shadowed figure emerged from the darkness at the top of the staircase. A figure holding a poker in their hand. Miss Marple's breath caught. They had been too late. The killer had come to silence them. The shadowed figure at the top of the staircase loomed over them, the dim glow from the hallway casting an eerie silhouette. In the figure's hand was a heavy iron poker, its edge still darkened with what Miss Marple suspected was not just soot. From the fireplace, Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered to Mrs. Dobson, shrank back against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. Inspector Graves stood rigid, his hand twitching toward his revolver. But the angle was wrong. He wouldn't reach it in time. And Samuel Redfern, who had already been accused of one crime, knew that any rash movement now would only serve to condemn him further. So it fell, as it often did, to Miss Marple to act. She did not move or flinch. Instead, she simply tilted her head ever so slightly and regarded the figure with the same look she might give to a misbehaving child caught in the act. "Oh, Mr. Bellamy," she said softly, "do put that dreadful thing down. We all know the truth now, and adding another body to the count won't save you." A long, heavy silence fell over the room. Then, from the shadowed landing, slow, chuckle low, and humourless, Bellamy took a deliberate step forward, and at last, the innkeeper's face came into view. His usually ruddy complexion was pale, his jaw clenched. "You always were too clever for your own good, Miss Marple," he murmured. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Yes, dear, I do get that a lot. Bellamy's grip on the poker remained firm, but something in his posture shifted not quite defeat, but acceptance. He exhaled sharply through his nose, casting a glance at Inspector Graves, who still hadn't drawn his revolver. "I should have guessed," Graves muttered. "You had the most to lose, didn't you?" Bellamy's eyes darkened, but Miss Marple answered for him. "Yes," she said, her voice calm. "'Cause Bellamy wasn't just Colonel Fanshaw's old friend, was he?" Samuel Redfern's gaze snapped toward her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in front of her. "I mean, dear kid, that Mr. Bellamy wasn't just aware of the old scandal involving your father. He was a part of it." Samuel stiffened. "Right." Miss Marple turned back to Bellamy. "You thought no one would ever find out, didn't you? After all, what was one ruined man when you had a promising military career ahead of you? You let Major Redfern take the blame, knowing full well that he was innocent. You and Fanshawe partners in crime, so to speak." Bellamy set his jaw. Saying nothing, Miss Marple continued. "And for years, it worked, till Mr. Redfern here arrived in Little Darrow." Samuel spoke through clenched teeth. "When I showed Fanshawe my father's journal, I saw it in his face. He knew the truth was finally coming out." Miss Marple nodded. "And that was your mistake, Mr. Bellamy, because once Redfern confronted Fanshawe, he knew the past couldn't stay buried." Bellamy let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing around the poker. "Fanshawe was a coward," he said bitterly. "He was the one who started panicking, saying he'd write a letter of confession, that he'd make it right." "Okay." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. "So you killed him before he could." Bellamy laughed, short and bitter. "Oh, I didn't mean to, you know. At first, I just wanted to persuade him. Huh. But he was always the weaker one. Huh. I barely touched him before he fell back and hit his head on the desk." Inspector Graves' voice was cold. "You expect me to believe it was an accident?" Bellamy's mouth twisted bitterly. "Believe what you like." Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but there was iron beneath it. "It's strange, isn't it?" she mused. "For a man who claimed it was an accident, you went to an awful lot of trouble to cover it up." Bellamy's expression hardened. "You moved the body," she continued, "and staged it at the village green. You knew that if the colonel's body was found at home, there would be too many questions, too much risk that the truth would come out. But if it was found elsewhere, well," she gave a slight shrug, "a random robbery, a crime of passion, so many easier possibilities." Bellamy exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "And it would have worked too." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with something akin to amusement. "Oh no, dear," she said. "Not at all." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then Bellamy's fingers tightened on the poker once more. "You won't turn me in," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Not if I can make a deal." Inspector Graves laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're still in a position to bargain?" Bellamy's gaze darted to the door, then back to them. He was weighing his options, calculating the risk, and Miss Marple saw it coming before anyone else. The flicker of movement, a sudden shift in weight, the way Bellamy tensed just before he made a run for it. Miss Marple's voice cut through, the moment like a blade. "Oh, really, Mr. Bellamy," she sighed. "For a man with such a fine mind, you really are quite predictable." The hesitation was all Inspector Graves needed before Bellamy could make it past the doorway. "Okay?" The inspector moved, quick and efficient, gripping the man's wrist and twisting the poker free before Bellamy could so much as take another step. Bellamy let out a curse, but it was over. His shoulders slumped, and just like that the game was done. The following morning, Little Darrow was quieter than it had been in weeks. Word of Bellamy's arrest spread swiftly, but for once the village gossip seemed subdued. Miss Marple sat in her garden, sipping a fresh cup of tea as Samuel Redfern stood nearby, hands in his pockets. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. All this time, Bellamy was right there, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Guilt, dear boy, has a way of making people do extraordinary things to protect themselves. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair. And my father. Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. I dare say his name will soon be cleared. Samuel exhaled, the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. A silence stretched between them, but it was a comfortable one. Then, at last, Samuel turned to Miss Marple with a slight smirk. So, tell me, how did you know it was Bellamy? Miss Marple laughed lightly, setting down her cup. Oh dear, she said. I knew the moment he flinched at the mention of a debt of honor. She tilted her head. People always reveal themselves, Mr. Redfern. One only needs to watch. And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Another mystery neatly tied up as the quiet village of Little Darrow slowly began to heal. Mr. Bellamy stood rigid at the top of the stairs, the iron poker still clutched in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but the sharp flicker of his eyes toward the door betrayed his thoughts. He was deciding whether to fight or flee. Miss Marple, ever composed, folded her hands neatly and gazed up at him with mild curiosity, as though he were an unruly child rather than a man caught in the act of murder and deception. You know, Mr. Bellamy, she said, people always reveal themselves in the end. Even those who were quite certain they had been terribly clever. Bellamy's grip tightened on the poker. You're bluffing, Miss Marple smiled. Oh no, dear, I never bluff. She turned her attention to Inspector Graves, who, to his credit, had not yet drawn his revolver. He was waiting, watching like a cat before the pounce. The thing about guilt, Inspector, Miss Marple continued, is that it makes a person terribly clumsy. Bellamy let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. You don't know a bloody thing, Miss Marple. But I do. She took a slow step forward, her hands still clasped before her. You murdered Colonel Fanshawe. The words, spoken so softly, hung in the air like an executioner's bell. A muscle in Bellamy's jaw twitched. I already told you I didn't mean to. Ah, Miss Marple mused. That's the difference between an accident and a crime, isn't it? The actions that follow? Bellamy's nostrils flared, but Miss Marple was unshaken. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Graves. I must say, Inspector, that I have been rather concerned about this entire business of Mr. Redfern's accusation. Graves frowned. How so? She tilted her head. Oh, it was all so convenient, wasn't it? Mysterious witness, suddenly, recalling that they saw Mr. Redfern lurking near the green on the night of the murder. What remarkable timing. Samuel Redfern stiffened. You mean? Miss Marple smiled at him kindly. Oh, Mr. Redfern, D-Rye, meaning that Mr. Bellamy himself was the one who planted that little piece of falsehood. Bellamy sneered. You can't prove that. Oh, but I can, Miss Marple said brightly, because I already have. She turned to Mrs. Dobson, the Colonel's housekeeper, who had remained frightfully quiet through the entire confrontation. Miss Marple gave her an encouraging nod. Go on, Mrs. Dobson. Tell the inspector what you told me. Mrs. Dobson wrung her hands together, her breath coming quickly. It was Bellamy. Heard him at the Red Hart the night before he told the police. He was talking to Mr. Sims, saying that it'd be best if the blame was put on the outsider before the law started sniffing too close to home. Bellamy's face turned ashen. Miss Marple sighed. Now, Mr. Bellamy, you shouldn't have done that. You might have escaped suspicion altogether if you hadn't been quite so keen to throw poor Mr. Redfern to the wolves. Bellamy dropped the poker with a loud clang. His hands, now empty, curled into fists. You don't understand, he muttered. I did what I had to do. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Yes, dear, you did, but not for the reasons you told yourself. Bellamy's gaze snapped to her. What? Miss Marple sighed. You have spent years telling yourself that you and Colonel Fanshawe were equally guilty in the old scandal. That if the Colonel had simply kept quiet, all would have remained well. Bellamy said nothing, but his chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. But what you never admitted, Mr. Bellamy, was that it was you who planted the evidence that doomed Major Redfern all those years ago. Samuel went still. Bellamy flinched. You see, dear, Miss Marple went on, her voice ever so soft. Fanshawe felt guilty about it all along. He wanted to set things right. But you, she shook her head. You never could let it go, could you? Because if you confessed, your own crimes would come to light. Bellamy's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Miss Marple smiled sadly. And so, you killed him. Silence. Bellamy stared at her, his body trembling with pent-up energy. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward Inspector Graves, who had drawn his revolver at last. I'd suggest you don't try to run, Graves said flatly. We've got enough witnesses here to make sure you don't get far. Okay. Bellamy's shoulders sagged, the last of his resistance crumbling. His hands fell limply to his sides, and just like that tit was over, the next morning, little Darrow felt different. Mr. Bellamy had been taken away under heavy police escort, and the news of his arrest had spread through the village like wildfire. Miss Marple, for her part, sat peacefully in her garden, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she listened to the faint murmur of village gossip drifting over the hedgerows. Samuel Redfern stood nearby, watching her with undisguised admiration. You really are incredible, you know? Marple chuckled. Oh dear, I wouldn't say that. You should, Samuel said firmly. You saved my life. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I merely listened to what people didn't say as much as what they did. She tilted her head. It's quite remarkable how many secrets people give away in their silences. Samuel let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. So, what happens now? Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded him with kindness. Now, dear boy, your father's name can be cleared at last. Samuel's throat tightened. You really think so? I know so, Miss Marple said with certainty. And as for you, she smiled. I rather think you might have a great deal of life ahead of you, now that you're free from the weight of the past. Samuel looked away, his eyes glistening. I suppose I do. The two sat in companionable silence, the soft hum of the village returning to normal around them. And for once, little Darrow was quiet, not with secrets, but with peace. For the first time in weeks, little Darrow exhaled. The news of Mr. Bellamy's arrest had spread through the village like wildfire, leaving behind a peculiar hush, if the air itself was adjusting to the absence of whispered suspicions and dark uncertainty. By the following morning, the Red Hart Inn had closed its doors. Its once bustling tavern, now dark and empty. The sign above the door swayed slightly in the breeze, the cheerful painted lettering suddenly seeming faded, forgotten. The village green, which had been a place of whispers and worry, returned to its usual routines, children running across the grass, Mrs. Webb scolding them for trampling her flower beds, and Mr. Sims at the grocer's counter discussing the price of tinned beef as though a man had not been murdered mere days ago. Yet, beneath it all, there was an undeniable shift in the village's atmosphere. Miss Marple had seen it happen before. A great wrong exposed, a quiet settling of dust. Life creeping back in where once there was fear. Miss Marple took her usual morning walk through High Street, her blue eyes calm but watchful. She passed the post office, where Mrs. Kirby was already deep in conversation with a small gathering of women, their voices hushed, yet animated. Imagine it. Bellamy, of all people, Mrs. Kirby declared, her cheeks flushed with excitement. And to think, all these years we've been drinking his ale, and he had a murderer's hands. Always did. Say, he had a temper, muttered Mrs. Webb. Nodding, said Gly. Miss Marple merely smiled and continued on. She had learned long ago that villages had short memories. Soon enough, Bellamy would become nothing more than a footnote in the history of Little Darrow. His crime reduced to a story told in lowered voices at the pub over a pint of ale. Even the Colonel's murder, gay, shocking as it had been, would fade into the past, remembered only in moments of gossip or warnings to young men about the dangers of hidden sins. And yet, not all wounds were so easily healed. Miss Marple's walk took her to Brambledown Cottage, where Samuel Redfern had been staying since his name was cleared. She found him in the garden, leaning against a wooden fence, staring into the open fields beyond. He turned as he heard her approach, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Miss Marple," she nodded warmly. "You look rather less troubled today." Samuel let out a small breath of laughter. "Yes, well, it helps that I no longer have the entire village thinking I'm a murderer." Miss Marple chuckled. "Yes, dear, that does tend to improve one's spirits." A silence stretched between them, but it was not an uncomfortable one. At last, Samuel spoke again, his voice quieter. "I've been thinking about leaving." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Oh," he exhaled. "Place. Peaceful, but it's not home. I only came here because of my father's past. Now that his name will finally be cleared, there's nothing left keeping me." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then nodded in understanding. "Yes," she said. "I suppose there are some places one is meant to leave behind." Samuel's gaze lingered on the horizon. "Do you ever think about that, Miss Marple? About leaving?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a small smile. "My dear," she said, "I think about many things. But I've found that wherever one goes, people are much the same. They tell the same little lies. They hide the same small secrets. And sometimes," she gave him a knowing glance, "they commit the same terrible crimes." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know if that's comforting or not." Miss Marple laughed softly. "Go. I think it depends entirely on where one chooses to go." Samuel was quiet for a moment before turning to her with a thoughtful expression. "What will you do now?" Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Oh dear, I imagine I shall tend to my roses, visit with friends, and perhaps knit a bit more." She smiled. "Until the next murder, of course." Samuel gave a startled laugh, shaking his head. "Let's hope your quiet little village stays quiet for a while longer." Miss Marple simply patted his arm. "Hope, dear boy," she said, "is always a dangerous thing to rely on." As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, she let her mind wander. The case was closed. The guilty were caught. And yet, thought lingered like a shadow on a bright day. Something small, something that had not yet settled. Miss Marple had solved many mysteries in her time, and she knew this. There was always one final thread, one last detail that refused to be tied up neatly. And as she crossed the village green, she felt it, that nagging sense of something unfinished, something she had missed, something still waiting to be found. The morning air was crisp as Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window of Honeysuckle Cottage, a half-finished knitting project resting in her lap. Everything was as it should be. The case was closed. Mr. Bellamy, the murderer, had been arrested. Samuel Redfern's father's name was cleared. Little Darrow was beginning to return to its genteel routines of tea, gossip, and garden parties. And yet, there was something unsettling. A small, lingering thought, a final thread left dangling. Miss Marple had learned long ago that even the smallest details, when left unexamined, had a way of unraveling the whole picture. And this one would not let her rest. With a thoughtful sigh, she set aside her knitting and reached for a notebook where she had recorded every piece of the mystery. Then, slowly, she began to go through it one last time. It was a single line of TR, I was a single line of questioning that caught her attention. The timeline. Mr. Bellamy had claimed he had only killed Colonel Fanshawe after learning that Samuel Redfern had shown the Colonel the journal. That much, at least, was true. But something about it bothered her. If Bellamy had only acted after Samuel Redfern's arrival, then why had the threatening letter arrived days before that? Oh, then had sent it. Miss Marple reached for her teacup just as a sharp knock rattled the cottage door. She expected a visitor, but when she opened the door, she found herself mildly surprised. Inspector Graves. The man looked slightly irritated, his coat collar turned up against the autumn wind. "I don't know why I'm here, Miss Marple," he grumbled. "Only that something tells me you're not quite done with this blasted case." Miss Marple's lips twitched with amusement. "Oh, Inspector, I do so admire your instincts." Graves sighed. "What is it?" Miss Marple gestured him inside, then sat back in her chair, studying him carefully. "I have a question," she said. "Something that has been troubling me greatly." Graves rolled his eyes. "Go on, then." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Who, exactly, sent the Colonel that letter?" Graves blinked. "Bellamy, obviously." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear, I don't believe he did." Graves stared at her, his brow furrowing. "Bellamy was the murderer, Miss Marple. We've established that." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh yes, Inspector, indeed we have. But you see, Bellamy reacted to the Colonel's fear. He did not create it." Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Meaning?" Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. "I rather think there was another player in this game, Inspector. Someone who, even now, has remained completely unseen." The letter had been delivered before Samuel Redfern arrived in Little Darrow, and yet the threat in that letter had spoken of consequences if the Colonel did not comply. Comply with what? Miss Marple had spent days thinking the letter was tied to the past, to the long-buried scandal that had destroyed Major Redfern. But now, she wondered, what if it was about something else entirely? By early afternoon, Miss Marple and Inspector Graves were standing once more in the study of Brambledown House, where the Colonel had met his end. The place had already begun to feel like a relic, its polished furniture coated in the first traces of dust, the air heavy with the absence of its owner. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her fingers trailing lightly over the worn wood. "There is something missing," she murmured. Graves folded his arms. "What?" Miss Marple turned to him, her blue eyes sharp with understanding. "A motive, dear Inspector." Graves frowned. "Bellamy killed Fanshawe to stop him from confessing." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, but what if someone else had a reason to want the Colonel dead too?" Miss Marple pulled open a drawer in the desk and retrieved a bundle of letters tied together neatly with twine. She flipped through them delicately until she found what she was looking for. A personal account ledger. Her eyes flickered over the pages, then paused. There it was. A name. A single, damning name. Miss Marple let out a quiet sigh. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I rather think we may have been too hasty in considering this case closed." Graves leaned over her shoulder. "What is it?" Miss Marple tapped the page lightly. A record of large withdrawals spread out over several months. Money being funneled into a private account under a name that should not have been there at all. The name of Mrs. Dobson. Graves let out a sharp curse. "The housekeeper." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm. "I rather think she was stealing from him for quite some time, Inspector." Graves ran a hand down his face. "And the letter?" Miss Marple sighed. She knew the Colonel was growing suspicious. She said, "So she sent a letter of fake threat, hoping to frighten him into silence." Graves' face darkened. "Then Bellamy killed him before she had to." Miss Marple gave a slight nod, a rather fortunate coincidence for her. "Wouldn't you say?" Graves exhaled sharply. "So, she let Bellamy take the fall." Miss Marple gave him a meaningful look. She let him do all the dirty work for her, Inspector. Graves' jaw tightened, and then sat back while the whole village gossiped about the murder. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, Inspector," she said pleasantly, "some crimes are simply a matter of waiting for the right person to take the blame." Mrs. Dobson was arrested the next morning, her crime one of theft and deception rather than murder. Yet, in some ways, her sin had been just as great. She had pushed Colonel Fanshawe into paranoia, and in his weakened state of fear, he had turned to Bellamy, who had, in his own panic, committed the ultimate crime in the end. Miss Marple was right. The case had not been as neatly tied up as it first appeared. There had been one final thread of quiet crime, hiding in the shadows of a greater one. But now, at last, the village could return to peace. For now, because little Darrow, like all villages, was never truly without its secrets. And Miss Marple, she would always be watching.